we just kept going back and forth, and we're like, are we fucking crazy? Like, is this actually like how we're both feeling right now? She was saying that shit too.
At least you were feeling something, brother. I distinctly remember the type of feeling I had before I started blogging, which I think was like the first time I had a real voice in the industry. Like, I was making videos for Run It Once, but they weren't personal. It didn't really reflect any sort of inner experience that I was going through. And you know, I had a decent amount of success in my career on and off with cycles and the games getting tougher and strategies developing. But I had found myself specifically at this period of time, like 2015, early 2015, in a really inward place of turmoil. And the thing that kept running through my mind was like, does anybody else feel like this? Because if they did, I really feel like people would be talking about it. And then I had to sort of check myself, and I was like, yeah, but wait, Nick, like, you feel this way and you're not talking about it. So my solution to this was basically like an experiment. I started that blog to basically figure out if there would be a response, because if there was a response, then I would sort of know I'm not crazy. Like, if people started to come out of the woodwork and say, yeah, like, we feel this way too, we're struggling for direction too, we're completely confused too, in some way that would be like cathartic for me. Because I think the journey for me has always been one of trying to reconcile this deep feeling of being misunderstood, deep feeling of confusion, lack of direction, all of this. So I think the next thing that came from that was people started to have this idea about me that I was kind of a serious dude. Like, the tone of my blog entries, even at the beginning, was just more serious, to the point. Like, this is the fact of the matter of what I'm thinking and feeling and considering. And that almost kind of intensified the emotions of feeling misunderstood, because, you know, you never want to get called a serious person. Like, in a lot of ways, that's not even like, it's not something that I think we would frame as good, but I think a lot of what people sense in me actually is that I take life seriously, which I think is a good thing. And when people do judge other people for potentially being, you know, overly serious or even like mildly depressed, which I definitely have to say I'm guilty of. Like, I've gone through a lot of bouts of depression. I think the main thing that everybody has to keep in mind is, like, you don't have context for what that person has gone through. And if you did, you might have a completely different take on their personality and why they choose to express themselves in that way. And so for me, this was about really trying to clarify, am I okay with the way that I'm expressing myself? When I started to become honest, which was like around the time of that blog, I was asking a lot of deep questions, like, how did it get this bad? Do I trust where I'm coming from enough now to want to express myself in this way? Or should I just stay in my little cave and do more inner work until I feel like I have something of value to actually offer? And it was a big transition for me, where it was moving from feeling extremely frustrated and insecure to finding a certain amount of strength in speaking my truth, which at that time was just about being very vulnerable. Having some things figured out, but for the most part just being very generally vulnerable about my position in life, emotionally and intellectually. And so I remember distinctly people were growing more aware at this time that I was sort of becoming more serious. And I remember sort of seeing it as an insult, because socially it's not the most fun thing to be a serious person. But I remembered where I came from. I remember how it got this way. I remembered specifically the night that I made a decision that I was really going to turn this all around. And it was toward the summer of 2015, I was at the height of my burnout with just GTO solutions, not making the headway I wanted to make, and feeling just overall confused, massively confused, frustrated. I was living with my girlfriend at the time, and I remember she was working the night shift because we had a lot of bills and not enough money to pay them. So we were both working extra. And I had hit a point of burnout that week. I talk about this time being sort of like my rock bottom, where I didn't even have the power to get out of bed and go play. Like, that's how bad it was. I couldn't muster up the energy to even go put in a session, and I got my backer who's, texting me on the other line like, hey, games are good, where are you at? Like, why aren't you playing? I was basically like hiding from the world and from the responsibility that I knew that I had. So my girl's at work. I'm spending another night in bed, lying up at the ceiling, frustration mounting. And I remember it was the first time I ever really prayed. And I looked up at the ceiling with all of these feelings inside of me, and I said, if you're up there, I need you to give me a little bit. And this was the most interesting part, was that I knew that I always had the ambition. I knew that I had the work ethic, and that's what made it worse, because what I lacked was the direction. And I remember saying, like, the exact words that I said were, use me. Because if there's somebody else who has this level of ambition and is willing to stay behind and build a bridge for the rest of the people that feel this way, you should give it to them. But if nobody else is fucking praying to you in this type of way and is this serious about it, I demand that you give me the tools to do this job. And I remember that, whether or not you want to believe in higher power or God, or whether or not I just set an intention and then followed through with it, I don't really care what you call it. What I care is that something about that moment for me was effective. I got results from clarifying myself in that way at that time. And I specifically remember those words. Like, I asked the higher power of the universe to crack me open and use me to create the bridge to bring people towards a more practical understanding of this profession. And since then, I've tried to stay true to the promise that I made basically to myself, that I would follow through on the intention that I set that night. Because the path that I took is an interesting one. It's like, I had two directions that I really could have gone after I got quite good. I could have gone to nosebleeds, and there's surely insecure reasons as to why I didn't, which makes the whole thing even more interesting. Some of my success barriers towards going to nosebleeds were probably what allowed me to dedicate myself so intensely to coaching and get so good at it. So can we really say that, can we really say those insecurities were a bad thing, or did they just have their place? More than anything, what I want people to take away when they look at my experience, if they really understand the context of my experience, is that there was a complete devotion to self-improvement the whole way through. What was lacking was a clear direction, and I found massive amounts of connection in the idea that I could potentially unite a lot of people with this same issue or problem. And I used that to my advantage, I would say, by creating this narrative where, it's me praying to a God I'm not even sure if I believe in, asking for the guidance or the power to be able to create something useful for others. And when you look at it from that context, I wonder if people would still, say, he's a serious guy. Sure, I take life seriously, but I wonder if people have struggled to the degree, to consciously struggled to the degree where they've clarified their life in that way, because the way that I see it, my seriousness is a direct result of having been pushed to a critical limit of suffering and then having no other choice than to say, okay, I've got to change it. I don't even know what way to go, but I'm changing and I'm making that decision right now. And then what happened after that point was nothing short of grace, in my opinion. It was an intuitive drop that I just started to follow, sort of like seemingly out of thin air. I began to receive guidance from myself as to a way that I could go about it in a more intuitive, holistically logical direction. Well, I think what we found was that there were more people going through something similar than I originally thought. I don't know if they knew what to call it at the time. I sort of coined the rock bottom dialogue in poker, I would say. I talked about it more than anyone, where, you know, there's a specific point where you know you hit rock bottom. And if you're still asking whether or not you're at your rock bottom, the joke is you haven't hit it yet, because you know. And to this day, it's like one of the main things I look for when we're doing the CFP applications. Like, some guys try to use the rock bottom frame as an advantage to them, and it rarely works, because it's very easy to call bullshit on someone who hasn't hit an authentic rock bottom. And that's why I really like the way that, like, we frame the applications, because if you study my content, if you've been a reader for a while, like, you know the types of things that are important to me in terms of judgment of character. And the beauty of having someone do a 2-minute face-to-face video is that you can know exactly what to say, and it's very hard to bullshit it face-to-face. Like, there's a certain energy around someone who speaks from the conviction of a rock bottom experience that, for whatever reason, you can't really put on an act. If you knew what a rock bottom was like, you probably wouldn't be behaving like you're behaving. This is the general vibe that I get. And to be honest, it's one of the main reasons I have guys do it face-to-face as part of the application process. It's because I want to look in that guy's eyes, and something about, like, I'm not perfect at this, obviously, but I think I'm getting way more of a read on this human than if I didn't look at him in the face at all. Especially these guys that claim that they've gone through a tremendous amount of suffering. It's fairly easy to tell if you're bullshitting yourself, and there's a distinguishment that's important here too. The important distinction is that there are guys that are suffering tremendously, and they fall in two categories. The guy who hasn't actually hit rock bottom yet, and the guy that is so stubborn that he's hit rock bottom but still hasn't taken the redirect.
I think it doesn't matter, even if they have hit rock bottom, as long as you're self-aware of where they're actually at.
I think this is cool, and it's totally true. And it's one of the things I talk to...
you can be like right in between those 2 points, being like confused, still not like fully experienced at rock bottom or all the bullshit. But as long as you're like self-aware that you're in that space.
As long as you're congruent. This is the biggest thing. Like, what I look for in an applicant is a threshold of congruence. I was talking to Nate. He runs a lot of the paradox mindset work that we use. We're basically working on a test that uses a large sample of winning, break-even, and losing players and throws them through the Harrison assessment, which is like one of the most powerful assessment tests for basically pumping out job suitability applications or job suitability assessments. And constantly what I talk to him about is the most valuable skill a person can have is to really be aware of their strengths and weaknesses, because that's what you should go into an interview with. I can't tell you how easy it would be to hire someone if they came into their interview and said, okay, 2 minutes, here's everything I'm good at, here's what I know I'm not good at, and here's how I develop that skill set of self-awareness. Just to have someone understand themselves beyond a certain threshold is already such a leg up, but people just haven't been trained to present themselves in this way because there's either such a knee-jerk resistance to being completely transparent about what's wrong with you. And what people don't realize is the more that you're trying to compensate by expressing yourself in a way where you don't want people to see what's wrong with you, the more prevalent that becomes in your communication. So you're really not hiding anything. It's one of the biggest things it's one of the biggest blind spots that I wish we could get people to see before they self-sabotage, especially in like something like an interview process. Like for people that have reached a certain threshold of balance in terms of like reading through personality, you're not fooling anyone who's already gone through the motions of the industry that you're trying to establish yourself in. Like you're not fooling a high stakes player by pretending to be someone who's already worthy of high stakes if you're not already at high stakes. One of like the most important fundamental realizations to have before you start trying to present your case to a potential coach. You gotta understand you're not there yet. And then the second question is, do you have the humility to accept that you don't even really know how to construct or guide your own path? And then this becomes sort of the paradox is we want to build independent learners, but the player has to be humble enough initially, to admit that he really has no idea how to direct his own path. So it becomes sort of the paradox of training a player is, at what point do you allow him the permission and confidence to start directing his own journey? Because it can be dangerous if he takes that confidence too early. That's what we would sort of call entitlement. And if he never steps into those shoes, well, then you deal with codependence, which is equally disastrous because the student basically never gives up his dependence on a coach to tell him what to do, and that's an extremely incompetent type of behavior. This manifests as players who literally can't ever solve a hand for themselves. They constantly need confirmation on every hand history. Really, within the context of our methodology, what it surfaces as is a student being unable to calibrate at high levels. Because the methodology can't solve everything. It can't give you perfect solutions to everything. So at the end of the day, what separates a really good high-stakes player from a guy who will basically never get past small or mid-stakes is his ability to, with conviction, calibrate it.
So it basically comes down to just being fucking real. Literally just being honest and real. Because you're obviously willing to help somebody who is just that. And that's like the only people that you want on your team.
It's really the only person who's available.
It's just real. It's honest.
The beauty of being real is it's a good proxy for how humble you are. And humility is necessary before you can be available for a training process. Really what I see, if someone steps to me from a place of congruence, emotional congruence, is I see a player who's primed for training because he's actually an open vessel. He's not already got his glass so full to the brim with assumptions and distortions about how it needs to look. Either how his strategy needs to look or how his process to success needs to look. I need a guy that can accept that it's probably not going to look anything like he thought it was going to look. But that's just logical. Because if you've been going at this for a while with an idea in your head of how it's supposed to look and that's not working, the most logical thing that you can probably come to the conclusion of is it doesn't look how you think it's going to look. Success is not going to conform to your perception of it. I was talking to my little brother. he listened to some podcast that he liked this quote. This guy who was the guest was saying, usually when people say something like, it doesn't make any sense, what he hears them saying is, reality is not conforming to the way that I think it should work, which is a huge indication that you've got to basically change your base perception of how reality works before you're going to get a result.